There's a part in Alan Wake 2 that I keep circling back to in my mind. I'd like to think we've all played or watched someone else play horror games before. I'd also like to think we've all probably seen horror films or TV shows before. And I'd like to think that through that exposure to different horror media, you've developed a good understanding of different horror tropes and cliches, and you've started to build up a sixth sense for when something is about to happen, whether it's a bad guy sneaking up around a corner, an obvious trap waiting ahead for you, or the always amusing, conveniently placed pieces of cover for what could only possibly be a boss arena. Survival horror games are no exception to these tropes and cliches. With this particular genre, you can expect a relatively low number of enemies, with ammo and other supplies being somewhat scarce. The weather is often damp and dreary, and the flashlight slowly finds itself permanently attached to your left hand. From the opening moments, you are being subconsciously trained on how those different systems work. A jump scare within the first 10 minutes welcomes you to Cauldron Lake. Enemies disappearing from right in front of you leaves you questioning reality, being chased down and brutally murdered before a large, punchy title sequence breaks that tension. On this educational journey on survival horror, you learn how to interpret different sound cues, and you understand what the changes in music and score are hinting at. You come across your first enemies and learn how to deal with them. You'll take a bit of damage and learn how to get yourself back in fighting shape. You start to pay closer attention to those unique noises around you and how they can signify when and where enemies are going to make themselves known. These teachings help you throughout the game, and you start to make mental notes of what parts of the map have enemies versus what areas of the map have so far been pretty easy to navigate. You figure that if you're on a fetch quest that requires you to move through an empty area of the map, chances are pretty high that when you're on your way back with the goods, you're probably going to have a bit of shooting to do. You understand that if you're running a little low on supplies and you come across an abundance of health items and ammo, there's probably a tough encounter coming. For the most part, Alan Wake 2 follows the survival horror formulas well. It's familiar in a way that makes you feel comfortable. You're confident in your ability to deal to the enemies. A couple of shots to the head should deal with this, you tell yourself. The more you progress, the more this familiar feeling washes over you. It's just survival horror after all. It reminds you of Resident Evil, and you trek along with the experience. Partway through the game, you find yourself approaching Valhalla nursing home. The architecture is straight out of any horror movie you've ever seen. You ring the doorbell and the nurse, Rose, greets you.
Oh, Saga?
After your request to speak to your family is denied, she reluctantly lets you in to speak with some of the other residents instead.
Sure. They always love visitors. Come on in.
As you move around the nursing home, you make yourself at home, even entering residents' bedrooms to borrow their ammunition. You eventually come across a woman staring outside, and you briefly meet Cynthia, who gives you a friendly jump scare before she disappears.
Sorry?
You can't forget to mention that you also come across a gentleman named Artie. As you listen to him speak, you realize you don't really have any idea just what the hell he's talking about.
Anything good on that jukebox?
We try to do good, but only Prime comes out.
But he seems like a great guy. Whilst exploring, you ask the residents where your grandfather is, and you discover he's been taken to the care facility next door due to an injury. After you discuss things with Rose, she eventually swipes you in to the facility. By this point in the game, you've got your bearings, you're familiar with the mechanics, you know what's going on, and you've faced enough Taken that you're feeling comfortable with whatever might come at you next. You're hopefully well armed, and those horror tropes from earlier have helped prepare you for what's ahead. As you make your way in, it's classic horror. You find yourself stalking the corridors of the hospital, carefully working your way through the halls. Noises from uncertain distances and sources are there to keep you on edge. A puzzle in a safe room demands a bit of brain power, but you persevere until you ultimately find yourself needing to put down a singular enemy to proceed. Just before you leave the hospital, the dark presence gives you another jump scare, and as you make your way outside, you discover Cynthia has lured your grandfather through an overlap, and to save him, you'll need to find a way to follow him. This process involves tracking down a vinyl record inside the nursing home, but it turns out Cynthia had stolen it and placed it in her bathtub. Unfortunately for us, to get into her room, we're going to need to turn the power back on. Artie lets you know you'll need to head to the basement to do this.
And check the generator.
So you start making your way downstairs. As you get back outside, you're greeted by two enemies that you'll hopefully be able to dispatch of quickly. This brings us back to the sequence I talked about in the beginning. Some of the most iconic scenes in horror movies have taken place in basements. A Quiet Place, The Conjuring, and Cabin in the Woods are just some examples. There's an innate fear of having to go into a basement. They're dark, wet, quiet, and cold, but they can also be places of refuge, areas to hide and hunker down. In horror, they are safe havens just as much as they are torture chambers. But with Alan Wake 2 and the events I've described so far, there was absolutely no way this basement was going to be anything but torturous. As you open the door, you step into water and realize it's flooded. The sound of the trees dancing in the wind outside quickly fades away, and you instead hear nothing but moving water. Crackling pipes and an unhelpful push from the game in the form of an unnerving score. It's dark. You're alone.
Key fob's no good without power.
The layout of the basement has just enough corners and obstructed viewpoints that you start mentally preparing for how you're going to deal with whatever enemy comes after you next. There are blocked pathways and notes that have been left behind. As you work your way through, you come across an empty fuse box and a place to save. Now your gamer brain starts to work things out. You begin saying to yourself, I know what's going on here. I'm going to have to work my way through to the end of the basement, grab the fuse, then fight my way back here to plug it in. So that's what you do. You trudge through the water, still keeping an eye in front of you, still checking behind you and around corners when necessary. because you've been conditioned for this. You know horror, you know basements, you know this game, you've seen what it does, and you're not going to let an enemy emerging from the water scare you. You find a note telling you where you can find a spare fuse. Strange noises continue to happen, and you keep an eye out, making sure to check that nothing is sneaking up behind you. You crouch through a small opening, finding yourself in an even tighter space than before. You exit into a new room, and those noises just keep bothering you. As you continue on, you find a workbench and newspaper clippings that talk about Thomas Zane and how much he loved Bright Falls. Interesting. You notice a projector, but obviously you won't be able to turn it on without the power.
The power's off.
You continue to look around and notice in the corner of your eye that there's a locked toolbox that needs a code. You find a manuscript page, and Wake appears to not be helping the current situation at all.
Someone in the bathroom with her. In the dark. Dark water pressed itself into her. She screamed.
You check a different toolbox. You continue slowly. Not because you're scared, but because you're prepared. You spot something on the wall, and you find a note that gives you the code. You hear something move in the water behind you. You turn around, but there's nothing there. You carefully head back to the toolbox to grab the fuse. You unlock the door back to the fuse box, and you walk over. Another strange noise as you enter the room, but you ignore it
There.
and plug in the fuse.
Power's back on.
You save knowing something's going to happen, then carefully head back to the projector, still keeping safe as there's surely going to be an enemy popping out now that we've completed our objective. You watch the projector.
Is this something they watch on movie night? That looks just like Casey. What the hell is going on?
Tension continues to build. Once it's finished, you decide it's time to head back outside. You continue to be cautious. Even doubling back to save, just in case. You continue on. There it is, the sound of the enemy, and they're close too.
Shit.
The dark presence appears, but you push forward and loot a previously inaccessible room. You step out, the dark presence again appearing in front of you, and you make sure to keep an extra eye on that guy who is definitely dead. You head back for the door you entered in. As you walk back outside, that familiar sound of trees blowing in the wind returns and the unnerving score fades away. Then it hits you. There was no enemy. The dead guy didn't come back to life. No enemies appeared around corners or materialized from the water. Nothing happened. You entered the basement, grabbed the fuse, plugged it in, watched a movie, and left. The word tension is defined as a feeling of anxiety and stress that makes it impossible to relax. Tension in horror films can be defined as the suspense experienced by the viewers when their imagination and anxiety takes over from what the film does not show them. In video games, this can be hard to generate. For video games, it's about instilling that sense of dread in the player, that feeling that comes over where you don't want to keep playing or exploring because things are just too scary. In survival horror games like Alan Wake 2, you'll only ever come across a small handful of different enemy types. As the game progresses, you get comfortable with these enemies, and the challenge you once faced from them begins to fade. The first time you encounter an enemy, it's a little scary and difficult, but by the 20th encounter, it's no longer surprising, and you know what you're doing. This isn't a secret, and in fact, I'd like to think it's a big part of why a decision was made to have no enemy encounter in the basement of Valhalla. This whole sequence lasts roughly 8 minutes, and those 8 minutes are taken from a roughly 20-plus hour game. The basement of Valhalla goes against all of the tropes you've been conditioned to expect, both from earlier in the game and from other horror media altogether. It causes a perfect concoction of fear, dread, and uneasiness that would be enough for a lot of people to take a break for the night here and use the expertly placed safe room to call it a day. If the sequence in the basement had ended by having an enemy or two break through the door at the end, or that dead body waking up to fight, it clearly would have been anticipated. I and many other gamers would have been ready for it, and we would have killed the enemies, made our way outside, and carried on with the rest of the game without giving it another thought. Would I have enjoyed it? 100%. Would I have the same adoration for that 8 minutes as I do right now? Definitely not. It can be hard for game developers to find that balance between tension and action. Oftentimes you'll find games will swing incredibly hard one way or another, rarely finding the ability to strike a good balance between the two. For me, the 8 minutes spent in the basement of the Valhalla nursing home stands head and shoulders above all other horror games I've played recently. And it's a true testament to the developers of a fantastic horror experience.
To take it all, blind to your pain.